It's a great, great day. It's a good day. Get up. Can't you see sunshine?
Woo! I see your dance moves over there, Andrew.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Looking good, looking good. Thanks for joining along. Gosh, risers and thrivers. Boy, am I ever happy to get to be back today. I always say I get to be here. I get to live today. And I feel the same way today, even stronger. This show with Andrew and several others were supposed to be recorded in the late fall. And I had several setbacks. My heavens, setbacks are par for the course with transplant life and, the gifts I've been given of having new lungs and new bone marrow and everything I've survived. But gosh, I was not expecting this one. Typically, these setbacks are a small price to pay for the gift of life. And, I kind of come out of them relatively unscathed. I'm really lucky. I ended up catching a small little bug from my kids. And I ended up having paraflu in my lungs. Not only paraflu, but that transferred to pneumonia and pseudomonas, and my lung function dropped by over 50%. I was getting really nervous about this, and my team was very alarmed, and so they put me on, tons of meds, and then all the meds have their own consequences, and it punted me into this state of adrenal insufficiency. And I was in the state of metabolic acidosis where I just felt so toxic, and my blood felt like it was just on fire, and it became full of acid, and my kidneys failed. I think kidney failure hits at what's called a GFR of 15, and I was at 8, and I was just feeling terrible. I couldn't maintain my blood pressure. I couldn't maintain my heart rate. I kept passing out. I did so in front of my kids. It was just so humbling, and I was just so scared. And I share this with you openly because here I am today, weeks later, out of the woods, thriving again. I am the luckiest girl ever. But in those hard times where we all face setbacks, success is not final, and failure is not fatal, right? I love that quote. Like, we always have to stay in our game and practicing our tools of resilience and our tools of mindset, and holding true to that power of hope when we have these setbacks, because life is all about rising and falling, and the rise and fall, and we are not defined by how many times we fall, but rather by how high we choose to bounce on the rebound. And nor are we defined by how many times we fall, but by how many times we choose to rise. And so I feel super lucky to get to be here with you today after drinking, tons of baking soda and water, which is not pleasant, I will say, tons of good old chicken broth because I couldn't maintain my sodium, and tons of fluids and, miracles that happen along the way. Here I am feeling spry. I will regain my strength. I've been on the hill a few times. I am not my strongest. It's not my prettiest, but I'm still up there having fun. Anyhow, I am very happy to be back with you. I hope you really enjoyed our last show with Joanna from Finland, who has struggled with reactive arthritis, ankylosing spondylitis. And check out her platforms to see where she's taken it. She is a competitive fitness athlete, and she has changed her life through taking accountability for her health. It's so inspirational. Hope you love that show. And today we have Andrew with us, and Risers and Thrivers, boy, am I excited for this show. Andrew and I speak a lot of the same language, kind of in different ways, but we really do speak the same language. And I'm really excited for you to be inspired by him today. Andrew Andrew transforms the fear we all kind of hold of our own mortality, right, into motivation to help us live our most thriving, active lifestyles and proactive in our own health and wellness, to help us live with more guts and gusto, as he refers to it. So we're going to hear all about his story of what brought him to this path, and Andrew's just going to inspire us all. So Andrew, I just want to take a minute to really welcome you to the show. This has been a work in progress for so long. We were connected by a mutual friend, and I am so happy to have you here finally.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you. Excited.
Ah, thank you. And so we are kicking off the new year together. We are kicking off 2023, and I can't think of a better way to do it. I had to cancel Andrew's show when I was unwell last month, and he's been very patient with us getting back in action again. So are you ready to go, Andrew? Let's go.
I'm ready.
All right. Andrew, so tell me, I'm really inspired by your work. What led to this? What led you to this passion of how you're helping people now?
You know, our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable. And, you know, I think you're a good example of that, where, you know, you talk about your previous life where you were on a health and wellness track and you were helping others to be healthy and well and had your thriving chiropractic practice. And then boom, your leukemia hits and suddenly your path diverges from the one that you had been on. And of course, a lot of what you do today is help others thrive through adversity, because of adversity. And you're a great example of someone for whom your story and your purpose are inseparable. You couldn't have probably scripted this purpose had you looked down the road, nor would you probably have chosen the way that your story has shaped your purpose. And I'm definitely an example of that as well. I think the critical bits, the defining moments in my timeline begin around 2020, 22 or 23 years of age. I had sort of a low grade, but now I see chronic level of anxiety in my life since I was a little kid. Hindsight has shown that to me pretty clearly. But then around 22 or 23, I had some vague but kind of persistent physical symptoms that didn't go away. I went to a doctor, and lo and behold, the doctor didn't do what doctors had always done before, which is say, oh, you've got this, do this, and you'll be fine. And it was psychologically the straw that broke the camel's back, and the accumulated psychological burden over my years of childhood into early adulthood just really overwhelmed my psychology. And I entered full-blown debilitating state of anxiety. And
Can I break this up for one
yeah,
sec?
go for it. Yeah.
So when you said you had vague symptoms as a child, what did that look like?
Snapshots I have when I think back on childhood would be like at 7 or 8 years old, I would get a stomach bug and think that it was mortal, like it was going to do me in. And that's not a normal thought for a kid to be that. Now I have an open personality style, which means I tend to take in a lot of the possibilities and the perils in the world. And people with open personality styles tend to do that and tend toward anxiety a little bit more than others, for whom they're less imaginative, might be a generic way of talking about it, but less open to the possibilities that exist in the world. And so there was that, but then I think there was this just underlying like vein of anxious tendencies. And so there were times like that, but there were never enough of them, and they were never intense enough for anyone in my world to go, Andrew seems to have an issue. We probably ought to have that looked at.
Did you recognize it was different at that time? Did you recognize it was kind of extreme, that you would associate a stomach bug with that fear?
I didn't as a kid. I was just a kid, and I was just having my reaction. But again, I don't think it occurred often enough or stuck around long enough for anybody in my world to think, hey, we need to take a look at that. In hindsight, you gain the benefit of some clarity on that.
Of course. And at 23, what sparked that change that increased, those symptoms were increased more?
It was physical symptoms, actually, that took me to the doctor, and his inability to give me a clear diagnosis kind of like blew the lid off of whatever ability I had to contain the anxiety. Because now suddenly, like, I don't know, maybe I'm dying. And my mom's dad had recently died of a heart attack. And I had that in the back of my mind. And my mom was talking to my mom about my vague symptoms. She said, that sounds kind of cardiac. Of course, in her world, she just had her dad die of a heart attack. So she was hyper aware of cardiac kinds of things.
Yes.
And I went, oh, well, maybe my heart's not right. Now, I had been a high level athlete all the way through college. Soccer was my sport. And so there was no reason under the sun to think that my heart was not in really good shape.
You were healthy and fit. What were some of those physical symptoms, though, that brought you to the doctor in the first place?
I think they were like gastrointestinal, like vague discomfort in my gut. I'd be running and not feel as well as I had. And, things that you might be able to attribute to 100 different possibilities. Many of them may be simply psychosomatic. My psychology was not intact. And so, but I wasn't aware of the ways in which it was working against me. So chicken and the egg, was my psychology
Of course.
beginning to produce physical symptoms? Were the physical symptoms beginning to exacerbate my psychology? I think the answer is yes at that point. So I suddenly found myself in this really debilitating, anxious state, really unable to function very well, barely able to hold together interpersonal interactions, just wanting to get back to my house so I could retreat to the safety of my room. And I went from being a young man who, in many ways, the world was my oyster, and I had been sort of a gold star kid all my life, according to the normal social metrics, academic, excelled academically, excelled in sports, excelled, quote, spiritually, if that's something one can do, having been raised in a Christian home. I hit all the marks, did all the stuff.
Makes sense.
But I was just falling apart. So suddenly the world was not my oyster. I was like just hanging on for dear life, truly. I mean, at one point I remember thinking, if this doesn't stop soon, I don't want to stick around. This is too painful. And that was kind of like, whoa, that was a new thought. I'd never thought that before. So that's sort of defining moment one, or chapter one in the story of how I've arrived at what I'm doing today. Fast forward about 14 years to around 2012, and my sister's husband gets a rare sarcoma diagnosis. And it was the sort that there were so few cases of it that it hadn't been well studied. There weren't well-defined treatments for it. There weren't well-known prognoses for it. And he began a 3-year cancer battle that unfortunately he ended up losing in 2015.
I'm so sorry. Can I ask what that was? What kind of sarcoma?
Oh man.
It's okay. Just curious.
It was alveolar soft part sarcoma, I think is the name of it.
Super aggressive.
And we didn't know that. None of us kind of knew. So we didn't know what to expect. And over that 14-year period, in the course of figuring out how to live with the anxiety, I remember I had at some point just said, you know what, physical well-being sort of be damned. It's all I can do to hold myself together on a daily basis, to work, to maintain friendships. I'm not going to be terribly concerned about my physical well-being. And I picked up some really stellar coping habits. I was abusing alcohol, picked up smoking. I was in the middle of sort of an early midlife rebellion. If you can do that in your 20s, I was doing it. I've always sort of done things a little bit sooner than most might, and I don't mean that in a positive sense. So I was sort of beginning to have, actually, no, maybe I was doing in my 20s what I probably should have done in my teens. So that was going on at the same time. And I was, my fighting weight for an athlete was probably around 180, 185. And I had gotten up to about 250, smoking, drinking heavily, not exercising. So I was in really bad shape. And as I watched my brother-in-law go through his cancer battle, I sort of literally and figuratively looked down at my gut and was like, dude, you're not doing your part to stick around for your wife and your 2 boys. And man, I had never experienced anything like the resolve and the determination that came along in that moment. And I went from, 250-ish to back to my fighting weight within about 9 to 10 months. And a whole set of improvements were set in motion in that moment. Fast forward again, and I didn't think about it at the moment. I wasn't like, that's interesting. Mortality motivated me. Maybe there's something there. I just was amazed at how I was able to turn things around. And that stuck. I've stayed in a much better place in terms of my health and all those kinds of things. And some of the lingering depression that was in the back of my mind resolved at that time too, I think largely as a result of nutritional changes. And the anxiety was still there, but I was in a much healthier frame of mind. And that ultimately led to a whole set of ripple effects in our lives that led us to move out to Steamboat Springs, Colorado, here where I live now, in 2014, when I was 40, for a pretty large scale.
For one sec, because I really want to pause on that, because you touched on some really good points, and I just want to slow it down for my audience to grasp all that, because that was really powerful, what you just summarized right there. And I want to kind of break it apart. And so, a long time of struggling, right, with anxiety and this fear of mortality, and it really impacted your life, from the ways developing these coping mechanisms of drugs, alcohol, this unhealthy lifestyle, right? And
Mhm.
still lingering with these, psychosomatic issues, as you describe, and mental health issues, and this anxiety, this fierce anxiety. Now, I'm sure you know better than else. What's the best antidote to anxiety?
Oh gosh, I better get the right answer here, huh? Um, for me, it's action.
Yes, 100%. Action. And what did you do in that time? You were inspired by what you witnessed with your brother-in-law through his own cancer journey, through him facing his own real mortality right in front of you, right? You were inspired by that to take action, right? And then your life changed. And those action steps are huge because if we're focused on action, right, it takes our focus off other things, right? That fear of mortality, because we're focused on action mode then, right? And what we choose to focus on is a choice. And what we choose to focus on, we give meaning to. And what we give meaning to, we give life to. And that becomes us, right? And so you chose to focus on these action steps. And I always recommend small bite-sized action steps, right? But you chose to focus on action and take your focus off your anxiety. And that is a powerful choice that you made at that transformation point. And I really admire you for that. You also decided to take accountability, to take agency, and to take responsibility. You took your focus off anxiety and just put it on your general state of health and wellness, it sounds like, right? And took accountability for your current state. And it sounds like you made a ton of changes. And look at you now. It's incredible.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's incredible. But you summarized a lot right there. So I really just wanted to break it down. Action, action, action. If you want change, create your action steps. What are you choosing to focus on, right? What are you going to take accountability over? What are you going to take? Andrew, you couldn't necessarily take accountability and responsibility or change over the anxiety. You couldn't necessarily change that, but you could change the surrounding parameters around that, which inherently then does change the anxiety. Whereas, let's say it can happen in any circumstance, like even with cancer. I'm never saying I was responsible for my cancer, nor would I say anyone else is responsible for their cancer. But if I don't take accountability and responsibility and agency to take a proactive change in the ways that I can, then I'm going to give cancer 100% control, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you would give that anxiety 100% control, just as happened until you were 36.
Mm-hmm.
And so taking those action steps and putting your focus onto something more proactive. I couldn't change cancer, but I could certainly change, my environment within myself and around myself. And that's what I chose to focus on. And it sounds like that's what you chose to focus on. And I really admire you for that.
I like to say a little phrase I came up with that emerged from that period. A lesson I learned was, if you're stuck, get moving. Some people will be able to relate to anxiety and to various mental health challenges. Some people won't, but all of us can relate to the experience of being stuck, whether you're stuck professionally or stuck personally or stuck psychologically. And we all know what stuckness feels like. Yes. It's irritating. It's aggravating. It undermines your sense of yourself. It's confusing. It's disorientating. And I think there's no simpler or more powerful antidote to a state of stuckness than simply to get moving. And if you're stuck on the couch, unable to figure out how to face the world, that can simply mean, well, I'm going to get up and take a walk around the block.
100%.
That's your
it can
first
be
step.
So hard, right? In those moments of stuckness, as you call it, I like that. When we're stuck, to even make a simple decision, right? But once we decide to make that one first decision, go for it. Know that that is your best decision and give it your all. And if you get to the end of it and you're like, shoot, maybe I shouldn't have done that, give the next decision your all. Just take those action steps. Could not agree more.
Yeah. Agree.
Powerful. Okay, so then I cut you off. I'm so sorry. So you moved.
Not at all.
Starting to get into this transition of where you are today. Please continue. I'm so sorry.
So it sort of set in motion some ripple effects. One of which led us out here, and that's another defining moment in my story. a little bit less relevant to why I'm doing and how I'm doing what I'm doing now. But it was a Herculean effort to get unstuck from where we were geographically and professionally, and get out to Steamboat, especially for me. I was afraid I was going to, anxiety was certainly having its way with me. I was afraid that in making a change, I was going to blow up my family and put us on a road to ruin. And of course, it's been anything but that. It's been quite the opposite. But that got us out here, and I spent a year sort of on sabbatical. I built houses for a couple of years during that time, trying to figure out what my next professional chapter might be. And about that same time, I had come to another point of exasperation with the anxiety because it was still there. And I just wanted it to go away. And I tried everything I knew, and it wasn't going away. And so I literally and figuratively turned around and looked at it. And I sort of see anxiety as like cousin It on the Herman family, the Munsters, whatever their names are. This little dude about 2 feet tall with hair covering him. You can't really see his face, and he's just always there and sort of weird, and you don't really want him around. I just turned to the anxiety and said, all right, you're not going away. Number one was an acceptance of the fact that anxiety was with me.
Yes.
And then I asked it, what are you here for? And of course I didn't get a verbal response back, but a couple things happened in that moment. In that moment of surrender and acceptance to the presence of the anxiety, changed almost instantaneously the story I had about myself. The anxiety had created within me a story about me that was one of weakness, of shame. I was not fully a man because I wasn't able to manage my psychology sufficiently. And it was a real source of pain for me. And immediately I began to see that, in fact, my struggle with anxiety, it was not a struggle that I asked for. I'm not clear where it came from. I'd love to know. Maybe in knowing, have an opportunity to gain even more liberty from it. But I just realized, man, I've been doing this internal battle all these years, and I have not let it keep me from doing anything, whether it's climbing Kilimanjaro, which all the way up, by the way, I was expecting my heart to explode, which is not a fun way to climb a beautiful mountain in Africa.
Got to talk about that later too.
Or, being able to secure the love and affection of a good woman, and then start a family. And I realized, hold up, I'm a different kind of warrior, but I've been a warrior nonetheless. And I began to have a sense of pride for the battle I've been fighting all those years. And it began to actually fortify me with a sense of who I was and of my capacity in the world. So that was
love this.
Go ahead.
I absolutely love this. And owning it, right? Taking that acceptance, this anxiety, this is here. I kind of talk to things like I talk to my cancer, or I'll call myself, like I'll do a lot of self-talk, and my middle name is Jane. And I'll be like, okay, Janie, we got to do this. Let's go. Like I talk to myself a lot, but you were talking to your anxiety. I love that. I used to sing to my cancer, like forcefully,
fascinating.
There's a lot of songs about our exes or relationships, like Kelly Clarkson, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and I'm quite sure it's to her ex. But for me, I would sing that out to my cancer, when I was mad at my cancer, but I would also get out that hurt and that emotion through singing to my cancer. Or like you sat with it, you finally sat with that anxiety, you recognized its presence, you kind of talked to it, and owning. When we own our story, no one else can use it against us, not even ourselves, most powerfully, right? Because how long did you say you had this self-judgment, where you felt less, right? Because of this, you felt weaker and more vulnerable. And then by owning your story and by accepting it, it became your superpower.
For sure. And as you said that, it helped me to see something more clearly than I've seen before, which is when I was relating to the anxiety in a victim-y way, in a less than way, it meant that I was also putting my anxiety upon others in ways that were unhealthy. Like, because I felt so badly about myself, I was putting all of that on others around me, especially my wife and my boys and close people who are close to me. Poor me. I need help from all of you. I'm less than. And so I wasn't bringing all of Andrew that's available into the world. I was bringing a much diminished version of myself. And the opportunity to relate to the anxiety differently and therefore relate to myself differently meant that I was visiting upon people around me much less of that collateral, very stealthy, but nonetheless present collateral damages. And I think one of the things that's come of the opportunity I had to relate to the anxiety differently is I'm able to take more responsibility for it now. My wife and I talk often about the fact that the anxiety I experience does for sure impact our family and my wife the most, because there are times when I'm just less present. I'm not totally absent, but I'm much less present because I'm parallel processing. I've got the outer world I'm interacting with, and I've got my inner world that I'm managing, which means less of me is available to the outer world. And we've just learned that it's important for me to say, hey, honey, I've got some anxiety stuff going on. It's mine. I'm working through it, but I just want you to know, because I'm probably a little less available than I ought to be. And she knows, okay, good to know. That's kind of what's going on. I don't have to jump in and fix it. I can't fix it. So it's helped me to own that. I think it's healthier for our partnership. And when I own it, it doesn't become anymore. It's less a, oh, poor Andrew, will somebody please help him? It's more just a heads up. Hey, I'm going through something, like you would if you're going to meet a friend for coffee and you caught the flu and say, hey, sorry, won't be able to meet you. I've got the flu. It's my flu. You can't fix it, but we'll have to meet for coffee later.
When you own your story, it can no longer own you.
Yeah.
And you're right. It does play into our interpersonal relationships. And it sounds like you adopted so much more self-compassion and self-understanding, which inherently, the more self-compassion we have and the more self-understanding we have, the more we exude of that to others. And that would inherently impact your interpersonal relationships and even just that basic communication and awareness. The awareness to check in, to be like, I have those two parallel worlds, like you're discussing, right? And describing. And the awareness to be reflective enough and to recognize when that's creeping up. Because personal growth and personal development, we're always on the ladder, right? Climbing the ladder. Like none of us ever reach the top. And we're like, I'm golden. Like I've reached my gold star of personal development. Like I have no more work to do. We're all climbing that ladder. And we all have these moments where the anxiety, as in your case, creeps back in, right? And it's adopting these tools that better help us cope with it. We're going to talk about these tools in a sec. In addition to the acceptance and owning our story, but it's these tools, right, that we can pull out of our tool belt. We're not saying the anxiety fully goes away, but these tools that we can pull out of our tool belt that then help us cope, adapt, right? Those of us who can adapt, thrive. Adaptability is the key to success. Cope, adapt, and rise to our circumstance. And that's the trick. It's not just like, okay, I had anxiety and I no longer have anxiety. That's not the goal, right? The goal is to adopt these healthier coping patterns. And this is really remarkable, Andrew. Please continue.
I'm trying to think where I was.
It's okay. You were finishing up. I really led you down a segue, but you were really talking about, acceptance and how you started to talk to it. And this was all really helpful.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That helps me. Yeah. So, I eventually realized, as I reflected back on the first chapter of my life when I've been in the nonprofit communications world and led a fairly large team for a time, that what I enjoyed most about leading a team was having, pretty intimate conversations about how they were doing, whether it was in the workplace or in their personal life. They got a lot out of it, and I got a lot of energy out of it. And so I began to move toward this coaching realm that seemed like, hey, I could do that all day long. So I'd like to do that. So I was beginning to move into the coaching realm, so I could have those kinds of conversations more often. And it was about the same time that I had upgraded my relationship with the anxiety. And this is the second benefit that it had when I began to relate to the anxiety differently, was it began to be useful to me. Not only did I think about myself differently and upgrade my relationship to myself, but anxiety began to feed me ideas. And so I was walking around town here in Steamboat one day, and suddenly, I don't know if this ever happened to you or anyone listening, but suddenly a phrase popped to mind from seemingly out of nowhere. How this happens exactly, I don't know. It's fascinating. I think there's something going on in the ether and in the spiritual realm there. But the graveyard group popped to mind. because I've been chewing on, I've got this neurotic fixation with mortality and a fear of catastrophic health events. It's not great. It gets in my way a lot, but maybe a lot of us, especially in the Western developed world, the Western affluent world, developed in quotes, because there's many ways in which we're poorly developed, but that's another story. Maybe a lot of us think about it too little. And as a result, we're sort of twiddling our thumbs on the way to the grave or to some crisis when it'll be too little too late. Oh crap, I haven't, mended that relationship with my son or my daughter. Oh no, I didn't pursue the dream. And now I'm going to my grave, not having pursued it. And so I realized that the graveyard group was a concept that potentially had some legs. And lo and behold, 3.5, 4 years later, we've got a number of graveyard groups going that I'm leading here locally. We're setting to launch 4 more here in the first half of 2023 to begin expanding the availability of the graveyard group to people. And what we do is voluntarily tap into the power of our mortality on a weekly basis to motivate us to live with guts, gusto, and abandon now, become the people we're made to be and live the lives we were made to live. So anxiety, my story, and my purpose in the world go hand in hand. I would not, like you, have chosen this script. I couldn't have written this script, but this is the story that I've been given, and it's what's led me to how I'm currently trying to fulfill my purpose in the world based upon my knowledge of my purpose in the world. And this, it won't be news to you or to anyone listening, I would imagine, but it's so true that when we look into our story to get better acquainted with our purpose, one of the best places to look is our wounds, because our wounds often, if we are willing to visit them and sit with them and learn from them, they're often the source of our genius. And
as my girl Oprah says, turn your wounds into wisdom.
Right. So this is not a new concept. I just am another example of how that's the case. And many of us, kind of walk around the world asking, what am I here for? And we then go out into the world to try to discover that. And I like to encourage people, no, you don't need to go out there to discover it. You actually need to look up a little more closely at your story, and how your story has prepared you for certain kinds of work in the world that you're uniquely suited for.
It's true.
There's a gazillion coaches out in the world like me, but none who are me, and none who are doing it quite like I'm doing it. And there's, not another Erica Harris in the world. There are other people doing podcasts, but not quite like you, because no one has your story.
Yeah, of course. And when I was struggling, in the face of a lot of struggle, the idea that my survival story could be somebody else's survival guide really empowered me to move mountains too, right? And for me, it wasn't necessarily in this capacity, in this platform. This all just unfolded really naturally. But for me, it was I decided at first, it's also overwhelming facing everything that you're facing. And I definitely let myself feel all of that. But then I was like, shoot, like my kids are going to face adversity, right? Like, what if they get a really hard diagnosis? How would I want them to rise to that? And so for me, it was trying to act like a role model for my kids for one day, not necessarily in this platform, but envisioning yourself, no matter what you're going through, right? Being that survival guide for someone else and being of service and of contribution. I feel completely compelled to do what I do and to act in the ways I do with, coaching and my podcast and my speaking events and everything as such. I feel truly compelled to give back because I'm only alive today because of the kindness and generosity bestowed upon me by so many people. I breathe through the lungs of another. I've got the bone marrow of another. Like, how could I not just want to give back and live this full, rich life in honor of all those gifts that have been given to me, But mortality I've faced mortality, as you're talking about, over and over and over again. And people often say to me, Erica, I can't believe you were told you had 2 months to live and your doctors gave you a terminal prognosis. Like, how terrible. Well, it wasn't just one major institution. I was given this prognosis by 2 international institutions, another one in the United States, the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Institute in Seattle.
Just to make sure you really knew you were dying.
Right. Just to make super sure, but shoot, I lost track. Where was I going with this? What were we just talking about?
Uh-oh.
Anyhow, I just think it's so important to keep your hope, to be of service, and to keep those action steps. I think everything you've discussed is so incredibly powerful. We speak the same language. Oh yes, no, about mortality. Everyone says that was like the worst thing anybody could have told me. But for me, to be honest, it was the best thing. Because when I first went into the hospital, they were like, no, Erica, don't green juice, don't do your supplements, don't do this. I felt like I had no control over my circumstance. It would all interfere with the chemotherapy and the medications, and it could cause other life-threatening consequences. And so I kind of handed everything over, but I felt powerless. And when we feel powerless, there's nothing worse. We struggle at that point, right? Pain is inevitable, but struggle really is a choice. And it comes when we feel as though we have no power over our circumstance. But then hearing I had 2 months to live, I was denied all further medical care aside from palliative care, right? I had nothing to lose. But by taking back my power and taking this agency that we talked about earlier, and this responsibility and this to look around my environment and within myself and to say, shoot, what needs to be changed here, right? What can I do to affect change over my circumstance? I wasn't even trying to change cancer. I was trying to live each day I was gifted to the maximum potential. I was trying to outlive like whatever I could live. Like if I had 2 months to live, I had a lot of living to do. And I still live my life like that today. I always say, like, we speak the same message, but in different words, right? And perhaps your words are far more powerful than mine. You're much more direct. I'm always like, if we're not here tomorrow, how do you want to be remembered by those that, what was your impact, And for me, it's always being this incredibly loving mama to my kids, but someone who lives this full and rich life and who gives back in every way possible. And I still live my life like that today. I don't know. I just told you this crazy story about last month. None of us know what tomorrow has in store. I certainly face a few more challenges, but none of us know what tomorrow has in store. And recognizing that life really is so much shorter than we realize, and taking accountability for that today and living our happiest lives, not waiting, not putting off today what can be done, or until tomorrow what can be done today. Changing your health status, changing your job if you're not happy with your job, make the appropriate action steps. Take control of those things today and know that, our paths are not infinite. And I want to live, don't get me wrong, till I'm 120 years old. But had I never had cancer compared to now, having been through everything I've been through, I have certainly outlived 10 times any life I would have lived before. I don't know how long I'll be gifted here today, but I'm just the happiest girl in the world, despite all the adversity and circumstance I've been through. And I think it's because of the message that you preach of facing that mortality every day. And every day, because of that, I rise, right? And I live every day to the fullest. I think your message is really powerful.
Well, that's the irony of our avoidance of our mortality. Of course, we
Yes.
understand it on one level why we avoid it, because it is, as far as we know, the end of our existence in this realm as we currently experience it. And there's something internally within us that just finds that repulsive. Makes sense. But I think we avoid confronting our mortality at our own peril, because we think if I were to get close, I think, or who said this most recently? Maybe it was Carrie Chown, who was on my podcast. Do you know Carrie? I can't remember if I introduced you guys. She's a double lung transplant recipient as well. I'll have to make sure I introduce you guys, but she's actually going to be on the facilitator team for the graveyard group. I think it was she who said, if it wasn't, it's something she would say, that confronting your death doesn't kill you, doesn't cause you to die. But we act that way, as if if I confront my mortality, then maybe it's actually going to kill me. And you're a testament to the fact that, in fact, it does the opposite. That when we pull our mortality close, and in your case, you didn't have a choice, but when we pull our mortality close to us, it sets us free. And
100%. I always say too. Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, over the past 3.5 years that I've been doing the podcast and the graveyard group, continuing to live with the form of anxiety I have, which especially revolves around mortality and catastrophic health events, I've discovered that it's healing me. It's a form of
Mhm.
exposure therapy. And the more I pull the thing close to me that I'm afraid of the most, the more courageous I become and the more it liberates me. But we tend to do the opposite. And when we as individuals and society at large pushes our mortality as far out as we can get it, it causes so much harm, not only to us individually, but to society. And I've talked to folks on my podcast who say, in fact, they think a lot of violence in our culture is largely a manifestation of avoidance of our mortality. That is a
Interesting.
crazy thought, but they made a really strong case for it because
Hmm.
we're doing everything we can to somehow put away this just violent fear we have within us of our immortality. And so for anyone out there listening for whom this is like, I mean, I prefer not to go through a crisis, and I definitely don't want to think about my mortality when I'm not in a crisis. I hope you'd be willing to consider just begin entertaining a little bit. Visit a graveyard, read the tombstone epitaphs, and look at the dash between the years and realize that represented their life, and consider the fact that you one day will be there, even if you're not physically buried. That will be you. It will happen. So there's nothing more status quo busting in my experience than mortality. There's nothing that causes us to be willing to take complete responsibility for our lives better than mortality. And you're a great example of that, because you said suddenly all of this agency and a desire to take responsibility and to act now in the moment flooded you. And you said you've lived multiple lifetimes over the past 11 or 12 years that your saga has begun, many more lifetimes than you might have lived had you never had this initial diagnosis and the experience that followed.
100%. It's really interesting too on my journey, because people often praise me, Andrew, for my, entirely positive mindset. And don't get me wrong, I believe 100% in a positive mindset, but I'm also a very real cookie, right? And I'm more of a realistic optimist, right? And I believe in my own ability to affect change, but that doesn't deny what I'm facing. And so I always tell,
Right. You're not deluded. I mean, you are
completely not
more awake
I
and
know
more
what I'm
aware.
facing,
Yeah.
100%. And one of my mantras that I preach to all of my cancer clients and anybody that I'm navigating with health challenges, and generally anybody wanting to live a better life, is prepare for the worst, right? And that's the same message you're preaching in Facing Your Mortality. I'm saying prepare for the worst. What is the worst that's going to happen here? For me, it was my mortality, right? But always expect the best. And so when I prepared for the worst, I had to go through that zone. My babies were babies, right? They wouldn't remember me. Like, sounds came out of me that I didn't even know existed when I was given this 2-month terminal prognosis. To think that they would not ever come to understand how much I truly and adored every tiny little thing about them. And so what did I do? I put it all in memory books. Like, when I fought to go home, I did not want to go to that palliative floor, and I fought to go home. If I had 2 months to live, like I said, I had a lot of living to do. But first I had work to do. And I really needed to prepare for the worst. I wrote those heartfelt letters, right?
Wow.
I did recordings with tears streaming down my face the whole time. We recorded breakfast songs that we would sing, wake up songs that we would sing. I recorded for my kids. I recorded this as if I weren't going to be here. I wasn't supposed to be here for that Christmas ahead. I bought all these gifts. I did all this stuff. I 100% prepared for the worst. And when I tell people this, they say, well, that's not being very positive. It feels like you're almost giving in to cancer. But I have to say, facing that, when I'm writing a letter for my son's grade 7 graduation, and I'm not going to be there in 8 years or whatever that was from that point, I assure you, it kicks in action even greater, because I really want to be there for that moment. So it affects me to rise to action and find my action plan as to how am I going to change my own circumstance. So when we prepare for the worst, when we accept our mortality or the worst case scenario that's coming, it will inherently cause you to rise higher on the other side, because you will take the action steps that you need to take. If I had cancer, if I had this terminal prognosis, Andrew, facing 2 months to live, if I was just like, oh, I'm going to be fine, I'm going to be fine, I'm going to be fine, I wouldn't have taken those action steps if I just believed magically somehow this was going to work out, right? And then how I don't want to say foolish, but you know what I'm saying? If my kids turned 20 and they looked back for, Mom didn't even write us one letter,
Mhm.
So that's always the first thing I have my cancer patients do is write those letters. Like it inherently reminds you why you want to live. It inherently instills much more action in the same way that you're doing these graveyard groups. And Andrew, we are short on time here, but you also do an amazing podcast called Andrew Petty is Dying. Tell us about that ever so quickly.
It's essentially the graveyard group in podcast form. You just don't have the group experience, but the idea is to equip people with the mindset and the means to live with guts, gusto, and abandon. And mortality is the secret sauce there. And I want to equip people with a mortality mindset, which is essentially voluntarily integrating awareness of your mortality into your daily life, living in 1 day increments, acknowledging that this is the only day I have, and in light of the fact that this is the only day I have, I'm not guaranteed another. And in light of the fact that I could die anytime, what would make today a good day? What would make me proud of the day that I've lived? And
100%.
however many days you get after that is great. And the podcast is a mix of solo shows on topics that pertain to developing that mindset and equipping yourself with the means to live with guts, gusto, and abandon, and interviews with fascinating people like you who have been to that bleeding edge of existence and returned to tell about it, because we want to capture as many lessons from people like you as we possibly can and act on them now. So that when a crisis comes, when it's our time to face mortality, we're not panicked. Instead, we're saying, I've been preparing for you. Hi, welcome. I guess this is time.
Yeah, don't wait for the wake up call.
Yeah.
Right? Just
Too
live
little, too late.
your legacy today. And I promise you will live your happiest life by doing so. Your richest life too. Andrew,
okay.
Yes.
We need to wrap up.
Yeah, go ahead.
I should say one practical tool that my wife and I have yet to do, but we're going to do soon, that people who want to experiment with this idea of embracing their mortality so it can set them free would be simply to connect with someone who can help you create your end of life plan. Not a financial advisor. I mean, someone at a mortuary. And you put together all of those plans, you put some money on file with them. You do all this stuff and you make it sort of a rite of passage for you, if it's just you, or you and your significant other, if you have one. And you go through the process, you begin the process of letting go of life and preparing for end of life now. And that's a good practical step that people can take.
And there's nothing that inspires you more than planning out your own funeral songs. I've done it.
Yeah, nice.
Like what songs would I want played if I weren't here? It sounds morbid, but you have to go through these steps because it really inspires you to live better now, whether I had 2 months to live or whether I live until I'm 120, right? This inspires you. These action steps inspire you to live your best life now. And today is all we have. Take your focus off everything else and live that best life right here and right now, friends. Risers and Thrivers, we have another great show on the books in just a few minutes at 5 p.m. PST. Stay tuned. There'll be another link and it'll be posted live again. Please join us. John, thank you for your comment. That meant a lot. Welcome to Rise Today. That means a lot that you're joining. Thank you. And Andrew, gosh, thank you so much for being here. You and I need to go speak on stages together.
Love it. Let's do it. Thanks for having me.
Talk really soon. We'll connect again. All the best, risers and thrivers. Make it a great day. See you in less than 5 minutes again. Bye-bye.